Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're here. I want to tell you just a couple things that's happening at the museum, and then we'll turn this over to Durant. If you haven't seen the community art show that's on display in the traveling exhibit hall, it's only going to be here until next Saturday. So take a look at that. There's a class that meets in the museum. Jim Brinson teaches that, and his students have done all that art. There's 70 pieces of art, and it's beautiful, and you need to check that out. And next Saturday, we're having a 5K glow run at 8:30 in Clinton on the Swamp Rabbit Trail, not to be confused with the Swamp Fox, but we would love for you to participate. The trail is paved, so people bring strollers and wheelchairs and all kinds of things. It's a fundraiser for the museum. If it's not your thing, we'll take your money. So it's a great fundraiser. We had a great time last year. We're also in the middle of our membership drive. So if you watch the mail, if you've been a member before, you probably received a letter asking you to renew. If you haven't been a member before, then we want to invite you to join, because your membership helps us keep all of these programs free and entrance available for everyone for free. We're committed to that, and you make that possible. The best thing you get out of your membership is that we have a museum, and we're so grateful for it, and we thank you for those of you who've supported us. We are moving several things down in the exhibit hall, so if you come to visit, we ask for your patience because we're in transition, because on June the 28th, Carolina Day, we're going to be opening our major exhibit of the Revolutionary War thanks to a $100,000 grant by the state of South Carolina. So Durant has put us through our paces, making sure that our facts are straight, and we're excited to share it with you. So there's going to be a full day of festivities on June the 28th. So save the date, and we will be sharing with you how that's all going to play out soon. So I'm going to turn this over to Durant, who's doing a series on the battles, and tonight is Kings Mountain. All right, Durant.
Thank you, Connie. I appreciate that. And it's good to see everybody. And hello to everybody out there in Facebook land. So tonight we are going to be talking about Kings Mountain, an extremely important battle, as you all know. Thomas Jefferson referred to it as the turn of the tide of success. He thought that Kings Mountain was the turning point of the American Revolution, and it's easy to make that case. Now, I did want to kind of bring you up to date on the history of the events that happened before Kings Mountain occurred. And in the South, it was a relatively period of calm for the first part of the Revolutionary War. All the action was in the North. But after the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, all the activity in the North was a stalemate. And the focus of the war, 6 months after Monmouth, when the British took Savannah, the focus of the war changed to the South. Now, Savannah fell on December 29th of 1778. 14 months later, Charleston fell because Britain had a toehold in the South now. Charleston falls. Boy, that's the world turned upside down. Immediately, the British forces established major forts at Georgetown, Camden, 96, and Augusta. And along with these forts, there were satellite forts. There were communication posts between the forts. There were camps between the forts. And from this is where plundering occurred. This is where loyalists who had been in South Carolina, who had been oppressed for the last 2.5 or 3 years, now they were on the ascendant and they were getting even. So it was a very bad time in South Carolina. However, there were starting to be signs of success. There were 3 points of resistance in the state of South Carolina during this time. Now, 95% of South Carolina had been conquered, but there was a camp of North and South Carolina militiamen on the Spartanburg County and North Carolina border under the command of Charles McDowell from Quaker Meadows, which is Morganton, North Carolina. And there was a camp in the Catawba Indian Reservation. And this was under the command of Thomas Sumter. And Thomas Sumter had 1,000 men in this camp. That was a significant opposition to the British rule. There were 4 roughly unorganized companies in the Petey area, Williamsburg, Horry counties. And these men, once they did coalesce under the command of Francis Marion during this time had a severely broken ankle. So he was not in the field, but by August he returned to the field, and these men, these 4 disorganized companies around the Petey area became Marion's men. So small victories, and there were small victories in Spartanburg County, for instance. This map here shows 5 battles in 4 days that pushed British lines back 40 miles. July the 12th to July the 16th, 1780. 2 months after Charleston Falls, now the militia in McDowell's camp up here at Earl's Ford. Those militia have coalesced, and there is a series of battles throughout the county. Cedar Spring, Fort Gowan, Earl's Ford, Shiloh Church, Fort Prince. Fort Prince was one of these satellite forts where the plundering was occurring. But after this series of battles, the British realized they could not hold Spartanburg County, and they retreated back 40 miles, and now this area here is under Patriot control. Also, July the 12th was when the Battle of Huck's Defeat occurred. And this was a significant victory because militia, under the leadership of William Bratton, these are untrained farm boys that just practice once a month. They're shooting and they're riding and they're drinking. Now they're fighting. And they defeat Christian Huck. That's a misnomer of a name there. Christian Huck was a British provincial. He was an American, and he was leading Americans. He was leading provincials, Americans fighting for the British cause, trained by the British, supplied by the British, paid by the British. They were almost equal to British regulars. And at Huck's defeat on July the 12th, the militia defeated Christian Huck, killed him, and his command as well. So, with this degree of activity going on, it got the attention of lots of folks in lots of places. And one of the places that the attention was received was over the mountains. Over the mountain where Isaac Shelby was with the Over Mountain men, and he kind of wanted to know what was going on. So he brings 60 or 70 of his men into the state of South Carolina. Now, Isaac Shelby came into South Carolina 3 different times. And on the first time, he goes to McDowell's camp, even though this was a mobile camp and it moved around. But it was in this entire general vicinity. And he got to McDowell's camp on July the 25th of 1780. The next day, he took McDowell's men to Fort Thickety. And Fort Thickety is right here. This is the general area where McDowell's camp was. The next day, he surrounded Fort Thickety with 600 men. Now, this was McDowell's men and a whole bunch of others. He was leading this, though. And he told the commander at Fort Thickety that he had to surrender. And the commander, Patrick Moore, says, I will defend this fort to the last extremity. And Shelby gave him till the next morning to decide. And Shelby had all his men standing in a ring in the wood line all the way around that fort. And when daylight broke, Shelby had his men take 2 steps forward. And when Patrick Moore saw those men, he surrendered without firing a shot. And he had 93 men in a very strong position. The biggest haul from this surrender, from this capture, was, yes, the 93 men, and they had to sign paroles that they would never fight again. If they did, that they would be hung on the spot. But the other thing was they recovered 250 muskets loaded with buck and ball. Those 93 men with those 250 muskets could have created a ton of damage to Shelby's men, but they surrendered. So Isaac Shelby and his men are in town or with McDowell for 30 days. They're out collecting peaches. At this time, Patrick Ferguson, who is at 96, which is about here. Patrick Ferguson, his title was Inspector of Militia. He was in 96. His job was to collect the loyalist local militia from this county, from Spartanburg County, Newberry, Abbeville, the local loyalists. And there's a lot of them, folks. So he is to train them, and he has been training them, and now he's on the move, and he's in Spartanburg County. And he and his men they found a peach orchard, and they start collecting peaches. Well, Ferguson's men were looking for peaches too, and they ran into each other. And sort of a running gunfight occurred, and the Patriots got chased away until they came to a spot where they got on top of a high hill, and the Loyalists couldn't attack them then. So this was a little bit of a standoff, if you will. It was a skirmish. The Battle of the Peach Orchard, the Battle of Wofford's Iron Works, and the Second Battle of Cedar Spring. That's the 3 names that this battle has. So after that, Shelby and his men are back in McDowell's camp. I told you there's a lot of interest and a lot of activity. A lot of people want to know what's going on. And one of those folks was Elijah Clark from Georgia, who had lived in Spartanburg County for 10 years before he moved down to Georgia, and he became Georgia's finest militiaman. You know, South Carolina's got the triumvirate of the 3 greatest militia generals, Pickens, Marion, and Sumter. But Elijah Clark belongs with equal distinction with those other militia generals as well, because he was very effective. Even though he lost a few times, he maybe shouldn't have. So, Elijah Clark and 60 or 70 Georgians go to McDowell's camp. Remember, Shelby and 60 or 7 over mountain men are in McDowell's camp. And also in McDowell's camp is James Williams from like 20 miles down the road right here, one of the leading men in Little River District, present-day Lawrence County. He is the commander of the Little River Regiment, and he has his backcountry South Carolina militia in McDowell's camp as well. And there was like a day or two until Shelby's men were going to be going back over the mountain. So Shelby knew he had to do something. So Shelby, Clark, and Williams collected 200 of their best men. And they knew that there was a camp of loyalists about 20 miles that way on the Enoree River at Musgrove Mill. And at this time, McDowell was on the Broad River, and these men traveled overnight 40 miles till they got down to Musgrove Mill, because they were going to attack those 200 Tories. And when they got to Musgrove Mill, there were some sentry shots. They traveled all night long, and this is dawn now. but the sentries saw them and fired some warning shots, so they lost the element of surprise. So also, they got word at that time that unfortunately 300 additional provincials under Alexander Ennis had arrived at Musgrove Mill overnight, and now these 200 men were facing 500 men. What do? They could not turn around and leave. Their horses were worn out. So, command by the committee, that's what we had going on here. They decided that they were going to set up a defensive works at the top of an old, abandoned Cherokee agricultural field that was rough and pits and valleys in it and everything, and underbrush. And it had a road running right through it, which ran through the breastworks that the militiamen set up out of logs and sticks and rocks and trees and stuff like that. Rudimentary breastworks. So what they wanted to do was have the Loyalists attack them. Well, how are you going to do that? What they did was they sent Captain Shadrach Inman from Georgia and his group of 10 or 15 or 20 men in a feint down towards the Loyalists and try to draw them in. So they tried to feint. Loyalists just sat there, didn't do anything. Turned around, came back, feinted again, nothing. Third time they feinted and they raised such a ruckus and everything, and it really upset the Loyalists on the other side of the river, and they charged across. And now here they come going up that road, kind of helter-skelter. You can't keep cohesion in that field the way it was. And they got within 110 yards of the Patriot defensive works when they saw the Patriots there. And they stopped, they formed a line, they picked up their muskets, and they fired right there at the Patriots. And every one of those shots missed. For one, because they were using muskets, and a musket is a very effective battlefield weapon. The best on the battlefield. But there's several drawbacks to it. One of them is the fact that when that musket ball comes out, it comes out like a knuckleball. It is not accurate more than 80 yards. And they had let loose their volley from 110 yards away. So those were all misses. And so the Loyalists regrouped, and I'm sure they loaded up, whatever. And they start charging forward again. And when they get 50 yards from the Patriots there, the Patriots let loose a volley with their rifles. These rifles that were at Musgrove Mill are the same rifles, the same riflemen who were at Kings Mountain. So, except for the Georgians under Clark, he had another mission during Kings Mountain. So, that was a devastating volley. But again, the Loyalists regrouped, particularly under the command of Alexander Ennis, and he was riding on his horse, the others were on foot, but he was making progress. He was pushing forward on the Patriot right. They were getting closer and closer when Alexander Ennis was shot in the neck, and he was unhorsed. And when he went down, the Loyalists lost all cohesion. And in this battle, with 200 Patriot militiamen, they are defeating 500 Loyalist militiamen and provincials. And it was a big victory. It was like roughly 75 killed, 75 captured, 75 wounded, numbers like that. And it was an overwhelming victory. And the huge advantage to that is that the Battle of Musgrove Mill happened during the Patriots' time, their lowest fortune in South Carolina. It was the day after Fishing Creek, which occurred 2 days after Camden. Camden was a horrible defeat. The Continental Army under Gates is coming down and they're meeting with Cornwallis. And the North Carolina and Virginia militia who were there, untrained, they were going up against the best British regulars there were, and that didn't go very well. The Patriots, militiamen threw down their guns, many of them still loaded. They didn't even bother to shoot and then run. They just ran. And Tarleton was able to come in behind the Maryland and Delaware regulars. And while the other Cornwallis's forces came up, it was an encirclement. The only way the survivors did get away at the Battle of Camden was simply to run through the swamps. And about half of the participants at the Battle of Camden, were casualties. So, as bad as that was, 2 days later, Thomas Sumter's got 700 men at Fishing Creek. He had just robbed the British supply lines. He had 300 cattle. He had a herd of sheep. He had 100 prisoners. He had 50 wagons loaded with goods. But he had been chased for 30 hours, and midday he stopped for a break. He thought he was safe. But Banastre Tarleton, with 170 men only, he came onto the scene. He saw Sumter's camp laid out before him. Many men were swimming and bathing in the two rivers there. They were in the British rum. And those 170 men just obliterated Sumter's 700 men. Sumter lost 350 men after that battle. That was the lowest point of Patriot fortunes in the American Revolution in South Carolina. But the next day, there's Musgrove Mill, which was a victory, and it provided a ray of hope to the South Carolina fortunes. So this map here does describe the three different times that Shelby came into South Carolina. And the first time was with Fort Thickety, Wofford's Iron Works, and Musgrove Mill. The second time he came in, this is when he was with the Over-Mountain men on the route of them towards Kings Mountain. And towards the end of the war, this is later in 1781, he actually teamed up with Francis Marion, and they surrounded they were able to take Fort Fairlawn, which was turned into a British supply depot. So not particularly fascinating with that third return, but kind of interesting. He and Francis Marion worked together on a campaign. Excuse me. So Cornwallis was just elated after Camden and after Fishing Creek. And when he got word of Musgrove Mill, he could not be more mad. He was furious that the state of South Carolina had the audacity to win a battle when he had just beat, their two best armies. So he was furious, and he was going to do something about that. His main goal was to move into North Carolina because he thought South Carolina had been conquered. So he was going up into North Carolina. He was going to make short shrift of the North Carolinians and then head up into Virginia and end the war. But what he decided to do as he was marching up towards Charlotte, he sent James Weems on his right flank up through the Chirals. And his instructions were to make the Chirals holler. And James Weems burned 50 houses in 50 miles. And he had Patrick Ferguson on his left flank to go up and chastise, negate the Over-Mountain men and Shelby and what he was doing. So the Over-Mountain men knew that, Ferguson was coming up after him. Now, this is a map of the Over-Mountain men route, and this is one of the clearest maps I've seen of this route. It's by Robert Lunsford. And the Over-Mountain men started gathering in mid-September, later part of September, up around Abington, Virginia, which is still over the mountains, and Sycamore Shoals, Elizabethton, Tennessee, and this area. At the same time, there were North Carolinians that were gathering together in Elkin, North Carolina. So, Patrick Ferguson starts moving up to sort of negate the influence, keep in check what the Over Mountain men were doing. Also at this time, now I told you about Elijah Clark was on another mission during this time. After Musgrove Mill, Elijah Clark and James McCall, which is a hero from Abbeville, and McCall and Clark worked together quite a bit. They were kind of feeling pretty good. And they attacked Augusta. Elijah Clark's from Georgia. So McCall and Clark attacked Augusta, and they besieged it for a short time. It was an absolute disaster, a terrible loss at the first siege of Augusta. Cherokees came on. They helped to break the siege. John Harris Kruger from 96, he was a very capable officer. He was the former mayor of New York City. He was a provincial. He sent 350 men to relieve that siege in Augusta. And as a result of that, Clark and McCall really lost out bad. And John Harris Kruger, kind of maybe the same philosophy that Cornwallis had. After any of these little victories in the backcountry of South Carolina, John Harris Kruger followed that up with a plundering raid. And so after the first siege of Augusta was broken, John Harris Kruger sent a fellow named Thomas Waters through the backcountry of Georgia. And we don't talk enough about what Georgia suffered during the Revolutionary War. This is west of Augusta. Thomas Waters burned down 100 Patriot homes. And he made refugees out of these people. And these refugees, the Georgia refugees, had no home to go to, and they were still being highly harassed. And so it was necessary that they leave. And where do they need to leave to? Where's the safest place they can go? Over the mountain. So while all this activity is going on leading up to Kings Mountain, Elijah Clark and his Georgia refugees are coming up through here. They kind of went west of all of this. They are going to Over Mountain. This is the level of communication that there was. Ferguson finds out that Clark has 600 people, and he thinks it's an army of 600, and he thinks he's dealing with an army of Clark's 600, and he gets two deserters coming over the mountain and telling him that there's 2,000 Over Mountain men collected at Sycamore Shoals. So that's why he turns around. As he's coming up, he comes up through here to Gilberttown. And this was one of his stops. I'm going to show you some pictures of Gilberttown in a minute. And when he's at Gilberttown, he writes 2 letters. And this is one letter that he wrote to the Over Mountain men. A proclamation. The proclamation threatened to march his army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste to your country with fire and sword if they did not stop opposing the British. And you can imagine the effect that that letter had on the Over Mountain men. Did not sit well with them. But then he wrote a second letter, I think maybe the next day, And this letter was to the backcountry North Carolina. He was in North Carolina. Those homesteaders, those loyalists. He was wanting to gather loyalist support for his army. And he writes this letter, proclamations, he hangs it up in the town square. If you choose to be pissed upon forever and ever by a set of mongrels, say so at once, and let your women turn their backs upon you, and look out for real men to protect them. Now, this statement, as naughty as it was, you're going to understand the reason I read this at the end of King's Mountain. So, Ferguson moves on his way. Now, this is Quaker Meadows. This is where McDowell, this was his home place. And this was a collecting place. Quaker Meadows is where the Overmountain men and the North Carolina men came together. And Charles McDowell during this time was somewhere in between Gilberttown and Quaker Meadows. And his 350-man command had dwindled down to only about 50. And he had 15 pounds of powder. So he was kind of in a not great shape. And Ferguson sends about 300 men, 250 men after him. And so those men are, chasing McDowell up through. McDowell sets a ambush. But somehow Ferguson and his men figure out how to get around the ambush. And the Battle of Cane Creek occurred then. This was a preliminary battle to King's Mountain. But McDowell and his men lost badly, and they had to literally run over the mountain into North Carolina, Tennessee, and escape from Ferguson that way. But Cane Creek, which is about right here, this was the high water mark of Patrick Ferguson. And this is when he thought he had to worry about Elijah Clark's 600 people. There were 500 women and children and 100 men. And he also knew that there were 2,000 men joining after him. So at this point, he starts to come back to join up with Cornwallis, who is now in Charlotte. So they start gathering at Abington on September 24th. Cornwallis takes Charlotte on September 26th. So he's in Charlotte while all this activity is going on, and Ferguson's thinking he's kind of overwhelmed with his adversaries, and he starts retreating back towards Charlotte and Cornwallis. So Cane Creek, you have that relatively small battle, but it was the end of Charles McDowell's career. And this is Cane Creek. On the road, you have to cross this creek like 12 different times to get to where you're finally going to go, which is Quaker Meadows or Morganton. This is Gilberttown. And you can see the valley. Gilberttown is gorgeous. It is a beautiful valley. There was only one family in Gilberttown, and it must have been an absolutely huge house with all kinds of barns and outbuildings and everything. It was the county seat for about 5 years. It's where they had trials in Gilberttown, but there was only one family that was there. Here you can see the outline of where the house stood, and it overlooked this beautiful valley, which is undisturbed to this day. And this is Earl's Ford, where McDowell's camp was, that Isaac Shelby came into. This is where the Battle of Earl's Ford occurred. One of our South Carolina archaeologists, Wayne Roberts, found that. Well, I just did a number. Let's see what we got now. All right. So on the route that the Over Mountain men and Ferguson took, Ferguson kind of went straight down this way here. The Over Mountain men looped around a little bit, and they marched down, they marched down, they marched down, till they got to the cow pens. And at this point, several hundred men from the South Carolina militia joined them at cow pens. At cow pens, there were 2,000 militiamen with the Over Mountain men, the North Carolina militia, and now the South Carolina militia. And they had word that Ferguson was just ahead of them, a day's march away, and he was somewhere in the vicinity of Kings Mountain. And at Kings Mountain, at Cowpens rather, the leader of these Patriot militiamen was nominated to be William Campbell from Abington. He had the furthest to come, and he had one of the largest groups. And he was 6'7" with flaming red hair, and you didn't mess with William Campbell. But that was kind of a nominal title anyway. There were 10 colonels, militia regiment leaders. And I told you about Musgrove Mill, command by committee. It's kind of the same thing at Kings Mountain. But significant colonels. Over Mountain men, Isaac Shelby and John Sevier. From North Carolina, you have Joseph Winston, Joseph McDowell, Benjamin Cleveland, William Chronicle, Frederick Hambright. South Carolinians, you had Sumter's men, who at this time were being led by Ed Lacey, and you had James Williams. And there was a group of about 20 Georgians there under the command of Candler, but he basically served under James Williams. So you got 2,000 men here at Cowpens, and you know that Ferguson is a day's march away. What these colonels decided to do was take their best 1,000 men with their best horses and travel after Ferguson. And they went in two different lines, on both sides of the road, in column formation, going on down. So then they got to Kings Mountain, and they found out that Ferguson was on Kings Mountain, where he had, settled in a defensive perimeter there. Kings Mountain, it was a very well-known place at the time. It's part of a very small chain of mountains. I think there's only 3 mountains there on the North and South Carolina border. And these are the oldest mountains in North America. They are said to be 600 million years old. The Appalachians are 220 million years old. Some geologists think that these are possibly cores of ancient volcanoes. But there's no telling how tall they were to begin with. And after 600 million years, you can imagine the erosion that happens there with the soil washing away, washing away, washing away. And as it does that, it leaves behind minerals. So Kings Mountain was very rich in minerals. The eastern face of Kings Mountain, somewhere around here, was loaded in iron ore. So these folks had been collecting iron ore from Kings Mountain the whole colonial period, and they were taking it up to William Hill's Iron Works next to the Catawba Indian Reservation, or they were taking it down to Walford's Iron Works, where that Battle of the Peach Orchard occurred. Those are the 2 iron forges in the backcountry, and it was the only industry in the backcountry. In addition to the minerals that had been collected from Kings Mountain, the top was a perfect hunting camp, and it was open. And this is where people knew the area because they would go there to hunt in the fall or something like that. And it was, relatively well known. So, and you can see it's the shape of Kings Mountain is referred to as a foot with the heel here and the toes up there. It's steep all around here, and I'll show you a picture of that. It is much less steep going down through here. This is a relatively gentle grade. Now, I will tell you, every time you look at a chart that arranges where the different regiments were, every one of them is different. And I don't agree with every one of them for one reason or another. And I like this map or this chart a lot, but I have William Campbell being right down here. The battle started with Campbell's group first. Campbell was in the lead, riding down towards Kings Mountain. And like I say, they had two columns. So his men set in first. Next, John Severe's men came, they set in. Then McDowell's men came in, and so forth and so forth. And the same thing was happening on the other side while this was happening. The last people in place were Cleveland and his North Carolinians. And the road to Charlotte runs right through here. Ferguson and his men could have left and taken that road if they wanted. But anyway, once Cleveland got in position, and he had to go through a bunch of swamps and everything as well. It took him a while to get there. But once he got there, the fate of Kings Mountain was sealed. So I like to use that map as far as the battle, and I'll go back to it in a minute. But this is the way I kind of envision, except Campbell is here where the Severe is. And the battle started when Campbell's men got in position and they started firing, and then the others, filled in around gradually. The defenders of Kings Mountain were Patrick Ferguson. He was the only Englishman, or he was Scottish actually, there. And there were 110 provincials on top of this mountain. The New Jersey Volunteers, the King's American Volunteers, an amalgamation of other groups, but there were 110 provincials on top of the mountain. Most of them were wearing red jackets. Some of them had green on. And then the rest of these men, about a total of 900 or so, it is said that Ferguson had 1,100 men, but he had 200 of them out looking for provisions. Of any group, a squad of 10 or an army of 1,000, 20% of that group was tasked with getting provisions. So foraging, plundering, was an important part of every army. So 200 of Ferguson's men were off somewhere else. And there was about 900 patriots and 900 loyalists here. The provincials in the red uniforms, they're armed with muskets, and they have bayonets on them. The militia that's there, the 700 or 800 militiamen, are all from here. The Little River Loyalist Militia, the Spartan Loyalist Militia, the Newberry Loyalist Militia, the Fair Forest or Union County Loyalist Militia, the Lower 96 Loyalist Militia. All the militia at Kings Mountain, there were Loyalist militia, South Carolina Loyalist militia. And they're going up against Over Mountain militia, North Carolina militia, and South Carolina militia right here. This is where James Williams was fighting. This is where Second in command to Thomas Sumter was William Hill, and William Hill was wounded. He was still at Cowpens. Second in command to Hill was Hawthorne, and then Lacey was a colonel, and he was a very capable colonel of Thomas Sumter's. So 3 times those provincials charged with bayonets. And they charged down through, it was Campbell's group, they charged down through, and the Virginians, well, they ran away. You're not going to stand up to a bayonet. But where do they run away to? And what does this group do who's all of a sudden, are they going to chase on after them? No, they're not. They're coming back in. And so then they did a bayonet charge on this side. And same thing. These folks, they ran into the woods. But you can't outrun your support, so they came back and forth like that. In the meantime, the rifles that were so effective at Musgrove Mill now are so effective at Kings Mountain. And I want to show you what Kings Mountain looked like. I don't know if you could see the steepness of the hill right here. And if you'll notice this picture here, and if you'll notice this painting here by Fred Bowen, who is a artist from Blacksburg, and I'm going to show you another painting of Fred's here in a minute. This is Fred's painting of the first casualty at Kings Mountain. This is a painting of the last moments of William Chronicle. William Chronicle was a 25-year-old major here. He fought at the Great Canebrake as a 19-year-old sergeant. And he was in numerous activities all the way through, and he was highly regarded. And at the age of 24, he was a leader of men here. And this denotes, the title of this painting is William Chronicle's last words. Face the hill. And as he turned to face the hill, shots rang out, and he had died. Now, William Chronicle is definitely one of the heroes at Kings Mountain. Another one of the heroes is Chronicle's commanding officer, who is Colonel Frederick Hambright. And I'm glad to announce that we have a descendant of Colonel Hambright right here, Jan Johnson. And we appreciate you being in the audience tonight. Exactly. So Frederick Hambright was Chronicle's commanding officer. But when they got to Kings Mountain, and he was about 45 years old, and he turns a 24-year-old major, and he says, look, I know you know this mountain because you used to hunt here. So I want you to take charge because you know the area, you know the terrain. And Hambright was magnanimous in his doing of that. But when Chronicle goes down, now Frederick Hambright is, the commanding officer. And he's on his horse. The colonels at Kings Mountain were on their horses. Everybody else was foot soldiers. But Hambright is riding his horse up through towards the top of the hill when he gets shot. But he does not let anybody let anybody know that he has been shot, and he's leading his men on when all of a sudden one of his men looks and sees blood pouring out of his boot. And he says, Colonel Hambright, you're wounded, go to the back. And he says, no, I will not do that. Frederick Hambright came to America at the age of 11 from Germany, and he had a very thick German accent the rest of his life. But he was not going to let his men see that he was wounded. Now, there are several monuments at Kings Mountain. One of the monuments is to William Chronicle and the spot where he died. But another of the monuments is where Frederick Hambright was wounded. And you can see that as you go through the trail there and come back up to the top. After the war, Frederick Hamby bought property within about 5 miles from Kings Mountain, and he lived there ever after. But he and William Chronicle are two of the folks that I really admire. Check out these trees. Check out these trees. This picture was taken right at the spot where William Chronicle died, and that is the scene, that is the site that Fred chose. So this is the monument at the top, the opening, and I would imagine that it was a very similar opening during the battle, and that as the Patriots came up the hill and everything, they were firing in on the defenders of Kings Mountain. So as the battle progressed and the Patriots started getting closer and closer and closing in, they knew that there was 110 people up there in uniforms, and then there was all this militia. And then there was the Patriot militia coming in on them. All these militias are farm boys, homesteaders. They're not professional soldiers. They do not have uniforms. They have one set of clothes for a year. And they are wearing those clothes, and all the militias on both sides have the same set of clothes. How do you tell the difference one from another? The way they did it was the Patriots put a white piece of paper in their hats, or a white feather, or something like that. And the Loyalists used a twig of greenery, a pine knot, something like that. That's the only way you could tell one from the other. So the Patriots did not know who amongst all these, uniformed people, who was Patrick Ferguson. Well, Patrick Ferguson had 2 traveling companions during this campaign. One companion was named Virginia Sowell, and the other companion was named Virginia Paul. And during the battle, one of those Virginias defected and came over to the Loyalists, to the Patriot side, and said, Patrick Ferguson is the one riding around blowing his silver whistle. That's how he was given commands. And he was wearing a red and white checked hunting shirt. So as soon as they realized that that guy riding around in the red and white hunting shirt was Ferguson, Severe's men took aim at him and shot him right here. And they just didn't shoot him. They shot him 7 times right there. And he fell off his horse. His foot stuck in the stirrup. He got dragged away. So Ferguson was killed. But it was hell on top of that mountain for the Loyalists up there. And second in command to Ferguson was a fellow named DePaster. And DePaster said, look, we got to surrender. I'm going to put up the white flag. He put up a white flag. And Ferguson, when he saw what it was, he went over to it and he chopped it in half. Now, Ferguson only had one good arm. His right arm had been shot in the elbow at Brandywine. And it was totally useless. Should have been amputated. He wouldn't let him. So he only has, one arm and a sword and a whistle. Those were what he was fighting with. But when Ferguson went down again, DePaster raised the white flag again. But passions are inflamed. We all know about what Bannister Tarleton did at the Waxhaws, Tarleton's Quarter. Was the white flag raised? These people over here, they don't see the white flag. it was a slaughter after the white flag was raised. There were as many as 100 loyalists killed at Kings Mountain after the white flag was raised. But it was such a confusing time. It's hard to, talk about what the effect was. But the loyalists that were there, the South Carolina loyalists, Patrick Cunningham, Bloody Bill Cunningham may or may not have been there. He may have been with that foraging party at 200 men. Somebody rode off that mountain in a horse that was a loyalist. That could have been Bloody Bill Cunningham. But those passions of seeing that slaughter did not leave these South Carolina loyalist militiamen. And after this battle, and there were 700 prisoners, about 125 dead, and the rest wounded. After that battle, it was total domination. I do want to read you one passage about what happened during this battle. And this passage is from the memoirs of Thomas Young, who was 16 years old during this battle. Thomas Young, in his memoirs, describes the Battle of Hammond's Old Store better than any account that we have. His account of the Battle of Cowpens is superb, stupendous. We really owe him a debt of gratitude. See, the information that we've got today was produced in the 1830s. This was from the 1843. The only people left alive to write stuff during that time were the youngsters, were the 16 and 17 years old. So that's their story that we tell in these days, because that's the story we know. And this kid, this 16 years old, 1 year after this battle, when he's 17, he is Major Thomas Young. This 17-year-old is commanding 35 and 25-year-old men. This was the presence that Thomas Young had. But this is his account of part of what happened at Kings Mountain. I well remember, continues Young, how I behaved. Ben Hollingsworth and I took right up the side of the mountain and fought our way from tree to tree, up to the summit. I recollect I stood behind one tree and fired until the bark was nearly knocked off and my eyes pretty well filled with it. One fellow shaved me pretty close, for his bullet took a piece out of my gun stock. Before I was aware of it, I found myself apparently between my own regiment and the enemy, as I judged from seeing the paper which the Whigs wore in their hats and the pine twigs the Tories wore in theirs, these being the badges of distinction. On top of the mountain, in the thickest of the fight, I saw Colonel Williams fall, and a braver or better man never died upon the field of battle. I had seen him but once before that day. It was in the beginning of the action, as he charged by me at full speed towards the mountain. Towards the summit, a ball struck his horse under the jaw, when he commenced to stamping as if we were in a nest of yellow jackets. Colonel Williams threw the reins over the animal's neck, sprang to the ground, and dashed onward. The moment I heard the cry that Colonel Williams was shot, I ran to his assistance, for I loved him as a father. He had ever been so kind to me, almost always carrying a cake in his pocket for me and his little son, Joseph. Joseph is 13. Remember Joseph. They carried him into a tent and sprinkled some water on his face. As he revived, his first words were, "For God's sake, boys, don't give up the hill. I remember it as well as if it had occurred yesterday. I left him in the arms of his son Daniel, 17-year-old Captain Daniel Williams, and returned to the field to avenge his fall." So if you'll note, what we're talking about is some of the battle scene, and also we're talking about the death of the commander of the South Carolina militia at this battle, Colonel James Williams, who actually had been promoted to the rank of general after Musgrove Mill because he had done so very well there. Now he is the last casualty at Kings Mountain, and he is shot in his head, and he dies the next day on the journey away. You notice this account describes Joseph Williams and Daniel Williams, James Williams' sons. Those two gentlemen were brutally massacred by Bloody Bill Cunningham, 15 miles from here at Hays Station. But James Williams is an absolute Lawrence County hero. He is our patriot general. He is our general. And I'm very proud to have one of his descendants in the audience as well today. And this is Betsy McKinney right over here. Betsy, if you'll raise your hand. So, James Williams, I'll tell you about the death of Patrick Cunningham now. So he was shot, somewhere around this hill, and he was dragged. And he was dragged to a spot lower down the hill where he, was dead. And he would have been absolutely stripped of his clothes. I don't think any soldier in the American Revolution was ever buried with their clothes on. Clothes were too valuable to bury in the ground. So all of Patrick Ferguson's uniform would have been confiscated, I guess. Boy, I'd love to know where that silver whistle was right now. Can you imagine that? So, Patrick Ferguson was killed. His body was stripped, and a hole was dug. And his body was wrapped in a fresh or raw beef hide. And I thought that was the most grotesque thing you could possibly do to a body, but I found out different later, and I'll tell you about that. And he was thrown into the grave there in his beef hide. And at the same time, they threw his other traveling companion, who was dead, in the grave with him, Virginia Saul, or Virginia Paul, or Virginia Sal. And then the men stood around in a circle and pissed on him, which was what he said he was going to do to them. That's why I read that passage. And they covered over the grave, and many visitors come to see Patrick Ferguson's grave, particularly visitors from Scotland, because he's a Scottish hero. And one of the traditions is in Scotland is when you visit a grave, you drop a stone in honor of the person. And this is a cairn that has arisen behind Patrick Ferguson's grave from visitors to the battlefield. And folks, they have to tear this thing down about every 2 or 3 years and start all over again. This is a continuous project. I mean, I've seen it taller than the monument, which is about this tall. So, I told you about James Williams, the last casualty, and he was taken away from the battlefield. And the next day, he died in the arms of his 17-year-old son, Captain Daniel Williams. And this painting here by Fred Bowen shows the burial of James Williams. This is his grave. You can see Kings Mountain in the background. I've been to this spot. I've been to this site. This is a marker that was put up about 1900, maybe by the DAR, where that site was. And this is in the middle of the woods. It says Colonel James Williams, SC Militia, Revolutionary War. It's deep in the woods, in a 300-acre site. And that body remained there for well over 100 years. When some of the fine citizens of Gaffney, and I think the mayor may have been involved in this, they did not feel like it was appropriate that James Williams' grave was forgotten in the middle of the woods, and they wanted to honor him, so they came and they dug the body up. And at a certain point, this monument was put there. And there was some kerfuffle or whatever you want to call it over the conditions of the body. I think it was stored in a barn for a couple of years. This is Gaffney, folks. You have to remember. So this is a photograph from not too far away from where that burial site is. And there you can see Kings Mountain in the background. But this is where James Williams is buried now. And this is on Main Street in Gaffney. And we really do. We thank Gaffney for the preservation of, James Williams and his memory. This monument was put up about 1900, 1910, double cannons. Now, don't let the fact that these are Confederate howitzers confuse the issue. No, there were no cannons at Kings Mountain, but had a couple of extra howitzers left over, and they thought it'd be good to put it on James Williams' grave. And Brigadier General James Williams, he never actually received his commission papers because he was killed first. So, after the battle, James Williams died the day after, but 7 days after, now these patriots have every bit of 600 prisoners. And their goal, their idea, is to march these prisoners up to the prison camps in Virginia. And they made them take all their shoes off, because shoes, they were valuable. Most prisoners had their shoes taken right away. Plus anything else, a nice shirt or something, you had to give that up. So these men had 2 muskets with the flints taken out, weighed about 10 or 12 pounds each, were barefoot, and it was October, and they were being trudged away. And a week after they were being trudged, and it was a rough journey, and they were being abused this whole time. And finally, the Patriots got to a spot where they were going to be splitting up, and Shelby and his men were going to be going back over the mountain. And they decided that it was an appropriate thing to have a trial for the Loyalist officers who had led their regiments in this battle. And they held a court, a kangaroo court, and they sentenced 34 officers to death. And where they were during this time is on Abraham Biggerstaff's plantation, a week's journey away from the battlefield. Biggerstaff was a Loyalist who fought at Kings Mountain, who was killed at Kings Mountain. And his wife and manservant were at the Biggerstaff home place when these patriot horde just took it over and had a court trial, sentenced these men to death, and then the next morning, they started hanging them 3 at a time from the Biggerstaff hanging tree. Now, this is the site. This is a pecan tree that's on the site, but that looks like a pretty good hanging tree to me. And they started hanging these men 3 at a time. Loyalists, militia, colonels, officers. And by the time they had hung 9 of them, they really had enough of that. And Isaac Shelby says, look, folks, let's get back over the mountain. And Shelby and the over mountain men split off from the North Carolina men. And those bodies were left hanging. The manservant had to cut them down, and then they buried them. But it was a brutal journey during that time. So, Biggerstaff hanging tree actually is somewhere around here. But the over mountain men, they peeled off. Remember, there's 600 prisoners. The South Carolina men never took this journey. They stayed back behind. And as the North Carolina men started heading up towards Virginia, and they came to their home places, they peeled off, they peeled off, they peeled off. These prisoners that were captured, this is the one thing that I scratch my head over more than anything else in the entire Revolutionary War. Those 600 prisoners escaped by ones and twos. There was one night, 100 of them escaped. By the time they got to the Moravian towns in around Winston-Salem, Salem, Bethabara, and so forth, there were 60 prisoners left. And the Moravians were known, and they were neutral, but everybody knew that the Moravians would take care of these folks, and they were probably the wounded ones that were left. Eventually, those 60 were picked up, and they traveled to Point Lookout, Maryland, where they were imprisoned. But the rest of them escaped. And where did they go? They went back down to 96. They walked all the way down through here. We've got accounts of their walking through and going to 96. And now, 3 months after Kings Mountain, these South Carolina loyalists are fighting South Carolina patriots from right here, Newberry, Spartanburg, Union, Newberry, Abbeville, Edgefield, Saluda, all these counties in the 96th district. Half of them have loyalist militias, and the other half is patriot militias. They are fighting each other 15 miles from here at Hammond's Old Store. And, that's one thing that I was not able to figure out. So that is pretty much a lot of the information on Kings Mountain. Of course, there's a bunch of others, a bunch of other information that's out there as well. But I did want to see if anybody had any questions at this time. Yes. Speak up because they can't hear you.
Great lecture as usual. I want to speak to a recent book. I want to ask
Bobby, I'll have to tell you, people can't hear what you're saying. No, on Facebook Live.
Great. Thank you, Durant.
Sure.
My question to you is, what book, if you had to pick one book, what would you recommend? And I'll wait till you answer to kind of give y'all maybe one book you don't necessarily want. Well, go ahead, Durant.
Well, the book I always recommend for, beginners, and this is the book that got me started. And if it got me started, I hope it can get y'all started too. And it's a book that was written in 1985 by John Buchanan, and it is the Road to Guilford Courthouse. And it talks about the activities in the backcountry of South Carolina very well during that time. Okay. Now, what book do you recommend?
Well, I mean, there's several with Kings Mountain, but the one I want to kind of mention, it was really, speaking of social media, it was really helped up. And I think maybe part of the problem is this, I think it's Philip Thomas Tucker. He's written on various subjects, PhD. Part of the problem is anybody's got over 180 books in diverse history, that's suspect. But I got really excited about a brand new book coming up about Kings Mountain. I went ahead and ordered it. I didn't think much of it, but I deferred to Eddie Lee, history professor there at Winthrop University. He's also on our SC 250 commission and knows a lot about Kings Mountain. He said it really wasn't worth anything. And then Ranger Rob, who's now the head ranger at Kings Mountain. But again, it's not that expensive on Amazon, but I just got caught up in the hype. But, you know, you have to consider some of it. You know, Lyman Draper was the first one. Of course, it was second and third hand, but it's all we had. What was that, 1850s?
1850s
right.
with Draper.
But, you know, Burt Dunkerley, there's a couple little small ones. But I agree with you. Buchanan's gives you that whole feel to the Guilford Courthouse. But thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, Frank. Now, you have to speak into the mic if you have a question.
Just explain burial in the carcass.
Oh, okay. Frank asked me to explain my thoughts on the rawhide, beef hide that Patrick Ferguson was wrapped in. And I thought that was a sign of disrespect when they did that. But then I read about the burial of James Williams, and James Williams was wrapped in a fresh beef hide and buried on the side of the road there. And I thought, why in the world are they burying these people in raw beef hides? And the reason is, as that beef hide dried out and became hard rawhide, it was a casket. It was just like a casket. So fresh beef hides were caskets back during that time. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, David.
Where was the map that you showed from Will Graves from?
That's from Will Graves' book. So the question is, where did this map come from? And this came from Will Graves' biography of James Williams, Backcountry Revolutionary. And James Williams has really, Will Graves has really straightened out the history of James Williams and the misinformation that unfortunately was printed well over 100 years ago by Lyman Draper, and Lyman Draper fell for a poorly written manuscript, and he took it word for word, and it was as wrong could be. And Will Graves pointed that out. Yes?
I just like to say also about Will Graves' book is that it gives you a lot of details of what was going on.
Betsy, I need you to start over.
Will Graves' book does a lot to explain what was going on in the community at the time, particularly of the upstate. And it points out a lot of things that are particularly interesting. After Charleston fell, I understand a lot of the people in the upstate, the officers, lay down arms. If I'm saying anything incorrect, do correct me.
You're right on.
But Williams was one of those who did not, because he realized the danger that people in the upcountry faced with the division and divisiveness between the Loyalists and the Patriots. So I encourage you to look at those books. The easy to read, and it's in sections. If you don't want to read the whole thing, just pick out a particular section, and we're grateful for Will Graves.
Can I say one other?
Yes, go ahead.
One thing I found out when researching over around Gaffney, when Williams was exhumed, they had his skeleton and his head, and they kept it out on display for a while. And then when they reinterred him, I understand that one of the hierarchy in Gaffney kept one finger.
Was it a middle finger?
Can I put in a plug for Gaffney, since we've discouraged it just a bit? If you don't know, this Friday is the grand opening of Carolina Rising. They have taken the old Carnegie Library and turned it into a permanent Rev War backcountry exhibit. So if you can make it Friday, great. If not, go check it out. Who in here has not been to Kings Mountain? Oh, well, that's a must. But anyway, and y'all, I'm Robert or Bobby Walker. Do a lot with SC 250, but I'm kind of helping York and Chester and Lancaster County, and I'm a Durant Ashmore groupie. I follow him all around the state.
We thank you, Bobby. Sure do appreciate that. Now, Bobby did mention the Carnegie Library in Gaffney, and here it is. So this is the headquarters of the Gaffney Revolutionary War Exposition, and I know it's going to be fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing it. They're going to have holograms and everything, so they're really getting fancy up there in Gaffney. Any other questions? Well, yes. Yes, I do.
Now, you mentioned brandy wine.
Yes.
Was that brandy wine of Captain Farley fame?
Well, I don't know. If I knew who Captain Farley was, I might be able to answer that.
Does Captain Farley sound familiar?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Confederate. Reinterred in Lawrence County, where he wanted to be buried instead of in Virginia.
So tell us the story about Farley.
Here's the man that knows.
Well, we're talking about the Civil War now? Yeah.
Well, Captain Farley was a young commander from Lawrence County, and he was sitting on his horse beside his general when a cannonball went through his horse and took one of his legs off. Well, Captain Farley died, and before he died, he told him he wanted to be buried with his leg. He didn't want to lose his leg. So he was buried supposedly at a girlfriend's family cemetery up in Virginia. And then later on, he had always wanted to be buried in South Carolina. An attorney up there got hold of some of Farley's information and found where Farley had wanted to be buried in South Carolina. So this attorney began work to expedite where he could be exhumed and go through all the legal ramifications between Virginia and South Carolina and transport him across North Carolina. And his Calvin Owens built a beautiful wooden coffin, and they carried that coffin up to Virginia, and the Smithsonian people exhumed his body, and through their radiation techniques, they found that this body, whatever in that ground, was missing a leg, but the leg outline was there somewhere on top of him where he had wanted his leg with him. And anyhow, he was exhumed, put in the box, transported to South Carolina, and a tremendous funeral was held here, as a Confederate officer's funeral would be, with horses and South Carolina battalion of Confederates. It was an amazing exposition of what would happen to a hero years ago. And he's buried over here in the cemetery, and you can go see him. And yes, his leg is there. Anything else, Don?
Thank you, Charles. Who in here was not aware of that? Well, very good. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you, folks. I believe we'll call it a night with that.